I still remember that night like it was yesterday. The splash of ice-cold water hitting my face. The shocked silence around the dinner table. My parents' contemptuous stares burning into me as water dripped from my chin onto my now-soaked shirt. "What's wrong with you?" My father's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerous. "Your sister needs this money. Are you really that selfish?" I was 14 years old. Kayla, my older sister by 3 years, sat across from me, her eyes downcast, refusing to meet mine. She was the genius, the prodigy, the one with the perfect SAT scores and acceptance letters from Ivy League universities. I was just Louisa. Average grades, no spectacular talents, no impressive achievements. "I told you, Dad, I don't have any money," I whispered, wiping water from my face with my sleeve. "How could I? I'm 14. I don't even have a job." My mother scoffed, exchanging a look with my father that I'd seen countless times before. Disappointment, disdain, dismissal. "Your sister's tuition deposit is due next week," she said coldly. "Princeton doesn't wait for excuses, and neither do we." I looked around at my family, these people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and saw only strangers. Dad, with his perpetually furrowed brow and calculating eyes. Mom, with her tight smile that never reached her eyes when directed at me. And Kayla, brilliant Kayla, who had learned long ago that staying silent was the path of least resistance in our home. "I can't give what I don't have," I said, my voice quivering. "I've been saving my birthday money for a new bike, but it's only $63. Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump. $63? That's what your sister's future is worth to you? A measly $63? No, that's not. Kayla has a full ride to Princeton, Mom interrupted. But she still needs money for her apartment, for books, for food. We've emptied our savings for her education. It's time you contributed something to this family." I looked at Kayla again, who was now examining her fingernails intently. She never defended me during these confrontations, but I couldn't entirely blame her. Standing up to our parents meant becoming their next target. "I'll get a job as soon as I can," I offered desperately. "Maybe the grocery store would hire me for weekends." "Not good enough," Dad cut me off. "Your sister needs the money now." "But I don't have it," I cried, frustration and fear making my voice crack. That's when Mom reached for her water glass. The movement was deliberate, calculated. She looked me straight in the eyes as she threw the contents in my face. "Then get out," she said, her voice eerily calm. The water was so cold it made me gasp. It soaked through my shirt, drops sliding down my back, making me shiver. But the chill I felt inside was far worse. "What?" I whispered, not believing what I'd just heard. "You heard your mother," Dad said. "If you can't contribute to this family, you're not part of it. Pack your things." I looked at them in disbelief, water still dripping from my hair. "You're kicking me out? I'm 14. "You should have thought about that before being so selfish," Mom replied. I turned to Kayla, silently pleading for her to say something, anything. Her eyes briefly met mine, and I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or pity, before she looked away again. "This is insane," I said, my voice barely audible. "Where am I supposed to go?" Dad shrugged. "That's not our problem anymore." I sat there, frozen, as the reality of what was happening settled over me. My own parents were throwing me out because I couldn't financially support my sister's college expenses. At 14, I pushed my chair back and stood up on shaky legs. "Fine," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I'll go." I walked to my room in a daze, pulled my school backpack from the closet, and started stuffing it with clothes. I couldn't think clearly. Where would I go? Who could help me? I had a few friends, but I couldn't imagine imposing on their families indefinitely. I had no other relatives nearby except Uncle Robert. My father's younger brother lived about 20 minutes away by bus. He and my father weren't close, another disappointment according to Dad. Uncle Robert was a high school English teacher who wrote poetry in his spare time, not the high-powered attorney Dad had become. They barely spoke, except at obligatory family gatherings. I grabbed my phone and the small box where I kept my birthday money. $63, the cause of all this chaos. I shoved it in my pocket along with my school ID and library card, the sum total of my official identification at 14. When I emerged from my room with my hastily packed bag, my parents were in the living room pretending to watch TV as if they hadn't just shattered my world. Kayla was nowhere to be seen. "I'm leaving," I announced, half hoping they'd come to their senses. Mom didn't even look up from the screen. "Close the door on your way out." Dad just nodded, his attention fixed on some game show where contestants were laughing and celebrating, winning far less money than what my parents were demanding from me. I stood there for a moment longer, memorizing the scene. My mother's profile illuminated by the blue glow of the television. My father's hand casually draped over the armrest of his favorite chair. The home I'd lived in my entire life, suddenly as unwelcoming as a prison cell. "Goodbye," I said to deaf ears, and walked out the front door. The night air was cool against my still damp shirt. I stood on the porch for a long moment, taking deep breaths to keep from crying. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing me break down, even though they probably weren't listening. I pulled out my phone and called Uncle Robert, praying he would answer. After 3 rings, his warm, slightly distracted voice came through. "Louisa, is everything okay? It's getting late." The concern in his voice nearly undid me. When was the last time my parents had asked if I was okay? "Uncle Robert," I said, my voice finally cracking. "I need help. Can I come to your place?" "What's wrong?" His voice sharpened with worry. "Are you safe?" "I'm fine, just—" I swallowed hard. My parents kicked me out. I don't have anywhere else to go. There was a stunned silence then. "They did what? Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." "No, it's okay," I said quickly. "I can take the bus. I have enough." "Money for that?" "Absolutely not. You're not taking a bus alone at this hour." "Where are you now? Still at the house?" "On the front porch. Go back inside and wait." "I can't," I interrupted. "They don't want me there." Another silence, longer this time. When Uncle Robert spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "Okay, listen to me carefully, Louisa. Go to the corner of your street and wait under the streetlight where I can see you. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do not go anywhere else. Keep your phone in your hand and call me immediately if you feel unsafe for any reason. Understood?" "Yes," I whispered. "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me," he said firmly. "Just stay safe until I get there." I hung up and looked back at my house one last time. Through the window I could see my parents still watching TV, unmoved by my departure. I turned and walked to the corner, my backpack feeling heavier with each step. The wait under the streetlight felt eternal. Every car that passed made me tense, wondering if it might be someone with bad intentions. In my sheltered life, I'd never been alone on a street corner at night. Every shadow seemed menacing, every sound amplified in the quiet neighborhood. When Uncle Robert's modest Honda finally pulled up, the relief that washed over me was so intense I nearly collapsed. He jumped out of the car before it had fully stopped and enveloped me in a hug that smelled of coffee and old books. "Are you hurt?" he asked, holding me at arm's length to examine me. "What happened? Why are you wet?" "Mom threw water at me," I said, the absurdity of it striking me for the first time. Uncle Robert's face darkened. "Get in the car. We'll talk on the way." As we drove, the whole story spilled out of me. The demand for money, my inability to provide it, the ultimatum that followed. Uncle Robert listened without interrupting, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Let me get this straight," he said when I finished. "They kicked you out, a 14-year-old minor, because you couldn't contribute financially to your sister's college fund." I nodded miserably. "That's not just wrong, Louisa. It's illegal." They can't just abandon their parental responsibilities because they're disappointed in you, which, for the record, they have absolutely no reason to be. We pulled into the driveway of his small bungalow, and he turned to face me fully. "Listen. To me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What they did is not your fault. You didn't deserve this. And you're welcome to stay with me for as long as you need." The kindness in his voice broke the dam I'd been building since I left the house. Tears flooded down my cheeks as weeks, months, years of feeling inadequate and unwanted crashed over. Uncle Robert pulled me into another hug, letting me sob against his shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he murmured. "You're safe now. We'll figure this out together." I didn't know then how those simple words would become the foundation of my new life. I didn't know that together would become the most important word in my vocabulary. I just knew that, for the first time in years, someone was putting me first. Uncle Robert's home was modest but warm, filled with books and mismatched furniture that somehow complemented each other perfectly. He showed me to the small guest room that doubled as his home office. "It's not much," he apologized, clearing some papers from the desk. "But the bed is comfortable, and it's yours for as long as you need it." "It's perfect," I said, and meant it. The room had a large window that looked out onto a small garden, bookshelves lining one wall, and a desk beneath the window. It was more welcoming than my room at home had ever been. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I can make some pasta or a sandwich." I realized I hadn't finished dinner before being thrown out. A sandwich would be great. "Thank you." While he busied himself, in the kitchen, I sat on the edge of the bed, still trying to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from Kayla. "Are you okay? Where did you go?" I stared at the message for a long time. She hadn't defended me, hadn't tried to stop our parents, but at least she was checking on me now. I typed back, "I'm at Uncle Robert's. I'm safe." 3 dots appeared as she typed a response, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "I'm sorry. I'll talk to them." I didn't reply. What was there to say? That I forgave her for her silence? That I expected her to fix what our parents had broken? I set the phone aside as Uncle Robert returned with a sandwich and a glass of milk. "You should eat something," he said, handing me the plate. "Then try to get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." "What is there to do?" I asked, taking a bite of the sandwich. "They don't want me." Uncle Robert sat beside me on the bed. "Right now, what they want doesn't matter. What matters is what's best for you. And what's best is for you to be with people who care about you." "Like you?" I asked in a small voice. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Like me." That night, in a strange bed in a new home, I cried myself to sleep, mourning the loss of the family I thought I had. But beneath the grief was a tiny, fragile seed of hope, the possibility that I might have found something better. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and something sweet baking. For a disorienting moment, I didn't recognize where I was. Then the events of the previous night crashed back into my memory, and I felt a renewed wave of hurt and betrayal. I padded out to the kitchen in my socks to find Uncle Robert at the stove, flipping what looked like cinnamon pancakes. "Good morning," he said, his smile warm, but his eyes concerned. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," I lied. My eyes felt swollen and gritty from crying. "Hungry? I made pancakes. And before you worry, yes, I've already called in to take a personal day. From school. I figured we had some things to sort out." I slid onto a stool at the kitchen counter. "Won't you get in trouble for missing work?" "Some things are more important than perfect attendance," he said, sliding a plate of pancakes toward me. Like making sure my niece is okay after her parents did something inexcusably cruel and stupid. The bluntness of his assessment startled me. In my house, my parents' decisions were never questioned, especially not by me or Kayla. "Have they called?" You? I asked, pouring syrup over my pancakes. Uncle Robert's expression darkened slightly. Yes, your father called this morning. What did he say? He hesitated, clearly weighing whether to tell me the truth. He said you were being dramatic and that I should bring you home immediately. My appetite vanished. Are you going to? Absolutely not. Uncle Robert's voice was firm. I told him you were staying with me until we sorted this out properly. What does that mean? He sat down beside me with his own plate. It means we have some decisions to make. Your parents have effectively abandoned you, which gives us a few options. We could involve Child Protective Services, which might place you in foster care. Or, I prompted when he paused. Or I could look into becoming your legal guardian. But that's only if you want to stay with me, Louisa. This has to be your choice. I stared at him, shocked. You'd do that? Take me in permanently? In a heartbeat, he said without hesitation. I've always cared about you, Louisa. I've watched how they've treated you compared to your sister, and it's broken my heart. But I didn't think I had the right to interfere. I should have done something sooner, and I'm sorry for that. The sincerity in his eyes made my own fill with tears again. It's not your fault, I managed to say. It's not yours either, he replied firmly. None of this is your fault. You're a child, Louisa. Their child. They're supposed to love and protect you, not demand money from you for your sister's education. I pushed my pancakes around on my plate, trying to imagine what life would be like, living with Uncle Robert permanently. No more walking on eggshells, no more constant comparisons to Kayla, no more feeling like a disappointment just for being myself. I think I'd like to stay with you, I said quietly. If that's really okay. It's more than okay, he assured me. But we should try one more thing before making it official. I think we should have a meeting with your parents, all of us together, to see if there's any way to resolve this. My stomach clenched at the thought of facing them again. What if they just insist I come home, but nothing changes? Then we'll know we tried, Uncle Robert said. And I promise you, Louisa, you're not going back to a home where you're treated as less than the amazing person you are. Later that day, after several tense phone calls, it was arranged. My parents would come to Uncle Robert's house that evening to discuss the situation, as my father coldly phrased it. I spent the day in a state of anxious anticipation, alternating between hope that they'd had a change of heart and fear that they'd somehow force me to return home. Uncle Robert kept me distracted by showing me his poetry collection and teaching me how to make his special spaghetti sauce for dinner. Cooking is poetry for the taste buds, he explained, as he showed me how to crush garlic with the flat of a knife. It's about transformation, patience, and knowing when something needs a little more heat or a little more time. By the time the doorbell rang at 6 o'clock, the house smelled of garlic, tomatoes, and herbs, and I felt marginally calmer than I had all day. Uncle Robert squeezed my shoulder. Ready? I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready to face the parents who had thrown me away. They entered the house like invaders, my father's eyes critically scanning the modest surroundings, my mother's lips pursed in disapproval. Kayla trailed behind them, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Robert, my father acknowledged stiffly. Louisa. Hello, Dad, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. Shall we sit? Uncle Robert suggested, his tone deliberately light, but his posture protective as he stood beside me. We gathered in the living room, my parents taking the couch while Kayla perched on the armrest beside them. Uncle Robert and I sat in the 2 armchairs opposite. The physical division felt symbolic. We're here to bring Louisa home, my father announced without preamble. This little tantrum has gone on long enough. Uncle Robert raised an eyebrow. Tantrum? Is that what you call it when a child seeks safety after being thrown out of her home? We didn't throw her out, my mother interjected. We were teaching her a lesson about family responsibility. By demanding money from a 14-year-old? Uncle Robert's voice remained calm, but I could see the anger simmering beneath. By throwing water in her face at the dinner table? By telling her to get out when she couldn't meet your impossible demands? My father shifted uncomfortably. You're only hearing her side of the story. I'm hearing the truth, Uncle Robert countered, and what I'm hearing is child abandonment and emotional abuse. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. My father's face flushed with anger, while my mother's paled. How dare you, my father sputtered. We've provided everything for that girl. That girl, Uncle Robert interrupted, is your daughter, and what you've provided is conditional love at best, outright rejection at worst. I looked at Kayla, who was staring at her hands. She hadn't said a word yet. Kayla, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. Is it true? Do you really need my $63 for your tuition? She looked up, startled, her eyes darting to our parents before meeting mine. No, she admitted quietly. I have a full scholarship, and the apartment near campus is already paid for with the housing. Stipend. My mother made a small distressed sound. Kayla, you don't need to explain. Yes, she does, I insisted, finding my voice growing stronger. Because you used her as an excuse to punish me for not being as successful as her. Again. That's ridiculous, my father scoffed, but the defensiveness in his tone told me I'd hit close to the mark. Is it? I challenged. You've been comparing me to Kayla since I was old enough to understand what failure meant. Her grades, her achievements, her future, they've always been more important than anything about me. That's not true, my mother protested weakly. We love you both equally. Then why am I the one who got thrown out? I asked, tears threatening again. Why is it always me who's not good enough? A heavy silence fell over the room. Kayla looked like she wanted to disappear. My mother's carefully composed expression was cracking. My father just looked annoyed, as if this entire conversation was a waste of his valuable time. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. Here's what's going to happen. Louisa will stay with me for the time being. I'm not sending her back to a home where she's treated as a burden rather than a beloved child. You can't just take her, my father argued. We're her parents. Parents who abandoned their minor child, Uncle Robert pointed out. I've consulted with a family lawyer today. You have two options. You can agree to let Louisa stay with me while you all attend family counseling to work on these issues. Or I can file for emergency guardianship based on abandonment, which will involve CPS and likely the police. My parents exchanged alarmed glances. My father's legal career wouldn't survive a child abandonment scandal. This is blackmail, my father accused. No, Uncle Robert said calmly. This is protecting a child who deserves better than what you've given her. The tension in the room was suffocating. I looked at each face in turn, my father's angry one, my mother's shocked one, Kayla's guilty one, and finally, Uncle Robert's determined one. I want to stay with Uncle Robert, I said into the silence. At least for now. My mother let out a small sob. Louisa, please, come home. We can work this out. I shook my head. No, I can't go back to being invisible and inadequate. I need some time away. And she'll have it, Uncle Robert added firmly, along with the knowledge that she's valued exactly as she is. My father stood abruptly. This discussion is over. We'll be in touch with our lawyer. Uncle Robert remained seated, unintimidated. Feel free. And while you're at it, explain to them why you demanded money from a 14-year-old for expenses that didn't exist, then kicked her out when she couldn't pay. My father's jaw worked, but he had no response. He gestured sharply for my mother to get up. We're leaving. Kayla, come. Kayla hesitated, looking at me with conflicted eyes. Can I talk to Louisa first? Alone? My father looked ready to refuse, but my mother placed a restraining hand on his arm. 5 minutes, she conceded. They walked out to wait in the car, leaving Kayla and me in an awkward silence. I'm sorry, she finally said. I should have spoken up last night. Why didn't you? I asked, the hurt still fresh. She sighed, looking suddenly much older than 17. Because I'm a coward. Because it's easier to go along with them than to fight. Because... She paused, struggling with her words. Because I'm jealous of you. That caught me completely off guard. Jealous? Of me? That's insane, Kayla. You're the golden child, the genius, the one they're proud of. I'm the one they control, she corrected. The one whose every move is planned and monitored. The one who's not allowed to fail, ever. You at least get to be yourself. I stared at her, seeing my perfect sister in a new light. I never thought of it that way. I'm not saying it excuses what they did to you, she hastened to add. It was wrong and cruel, and I hate that I didn't stop it, but sometimes I wish I could just breathe, like you can. A car horn honked outside. My father's impatient summons. Kayla stood. I have to go, but I'll call you, okay? And I'll try to make them understand. Don't put yourself at risk, I warned. I'll be fine here. She nodded, then surprised me with a quick, fierce hug before hurrying out the door. Uncle Robert returned to the living room after seeing her out. You okay? I nodded slowly. I think so. It's just, everything's different now. Even Kayla isn't who I thought she was. People rarely are, he said gently. We all have our private struggles, even the ones who seem to have everything figured out. That night, after a quiet dinner of the spaghetti we'd prepared together, Uncle Robert helped me make a list of things I'd need from home: clothes, school supplies, personal items. He promised we'd retrieve them soon, one way or another. As I got ready for bed in my new room, surrounded by Uncle Robert's books and the soft yellow walls that felt more like home than my own bedroom ever had, I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about measuring up to someone else's expectations. I was just Louisa, and for Uncle Robert, that seemed to be enough. The next few weeks were a blur of adjustments. Uncle Robert and I fell into a comfortable routine. Breakfast together in the morning before he left for school, afternoons spent doing homework at the kitchen table while he graded papers, evenings cooking dinner and talking about our days. Parents remained distant, communicating only through terse text messages asking when I'd come to my senses. Kayla called more regularly, though our conversations were still awkward as we navigated our new understanding of each other. The school year ended and summer stretched before me, the first summer of my new life. Uncle Robert had officially become my temporary guardian after my parents reluctantly signed the necessary paperwork, pressured by the family lawyer who'd made it clear that contesting the arrangement would lead to uncomfortable questions about their parenting. What would you think about redecorating your room? Uncle Robert asked one morning over pancakes. Make it more your own? I looked up, surprised. Really? You wouldn't mind? Mind? I've been hoping you'd want to. This is your home now, Louisa. You should feel comfortable in it. Home. The word settled over me like a warm blanket. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear it. We spent that weekend painting the walls a soft sage green, hanging fairy lights around the windows, and assembling a new bookshelf that would be filled with books of my choosing, not the educational tomes my parents had deemed appropriate. As we worked, Uncle Robert told me stories about his childhood with my father. Stories I'd never heard before. Your dad wasn't always so rigid, he said as we waited for the paint to dry. When we were kids, he was actually the wild one, always getting into trouble, challenging authority. My dad? I couldn't imagine it. What changed him? Uncle Robert's brushstrokes slowed. Pressure, mostly. Our father, your grandfather, was a tough man to please. Nothing was ever good enough for him. Your dad internalized that, tried to become what our father wanted. I went the opposite way, decided if I couldn't please him, I wouldn't try. Is that why you and Dad don't get along? Partly, he admitted. But it's also because I remind him of the person he used to be before he decided that success and status were the only things that mattered. I considered this new perspective on my father. Do you think he'll ever change back? Uncle Robert sighed. I don't know, Louisa. People can change, but they have to want to. They have to recognize something's wrong first. I thought about my parents, about how confidently they justified throwing me out. They don't think anything's wrong with how they treated me, do they? Not yet, he said carefully. But time has a way of providing clarity. Maybe someday they'll see. I wasn't. Sure, I could wait for someday, or if I even wanted to. The hurt was still too raw, the rejection too complete. That summer became a time of healing and discovery. Uncle Robert introduced me to photography, sharing his old DSLR camera and teaching me how to capture moments that moved me. I discovered I had an eye for details others missed. The way light filtered through leaves, the expressions on people's faces when they thought no one was watching. For my 15th birthday in July, he took me on a road trip to the coast, where we spent 3 days exploring tide pools, collecting shells, and eating ice cream for dinner because, as Uncle Robert put it, birthday rules trump dinner rules. No one mentioned the glaring absence of my parents or their lack of acknowledgement of my birthday. But Kayla sent a card with a gift card to a bookstore and a note saying simply, "Miss you, proud of you." It was during this time that I began to realize something important. Family isn't just about blood relation. Family is about who makes you feel valued, who celebrates your successes without comparing them to someone else's, who loves you not despite your flaws, but with full knowledge of them. Uncle Robert had become more family to me in a few months than my parents had been in 14 years. When school started again in the fall, I returned as a different person, more confident, less concerned with pleasing everyone around me. I joined the school newspaper as a photographer, made new friends who knew nothing about Kayla or my family situation, and for the first time began to develop an identity that wasn't defined by being Kayla's less impressive sister. My grades improved too, not because I was trying to match Kayla's perfect record, but because I was genuinely engaged in learning for my own sake. Uncle Robert celebrated each B+ and A as if I'd won a Nobel Prize, never once mentioning that. Kayla had never gotten anything lower than an A in her life. Thanksgiving approached, bringing with it the question of family gatherings. My parents had extended a stiff invitation for both Uncle Robert and me to join them, the first direct communication they'd initiated in months. "We don't have to go," Uncle Robert assured me when I showed him the text. "We can have our own Thanksgiving here, or go out for Chinese food, or fly to the moon. Whatever you want." I smiled at his exaggerations, but the decision weighed on me. Part of me wanted to see Kayla, who was home from Princeton for the break. Another part dreaded facing my parents across a dinner table again. "What do you think I should do?" I asked him. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that you should do whatever feels right for you, not what you think anyone else wants. Your feelings matter, Louisa, always." In the end, I decided to go, but with conditions. We would arrive just before dinner and leave right after dessert. Uncle Robert would stay by my side the entire time. And at the first sign of criticism or comparison, we would leave immediately. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear. I dressed carefully in an outfit I'd chosen myself, a green sweater that brought out the gold flecks in my eyes and jeans that Uncle Robert had distressed with me in one of our weekend craft projects. "You look beautiful," Uncle Robert said as we prepared to leave. "And remember, we can walk out any time. Just give me the signal." The signal was a tug on my earlobe, our private code for rescue me from this conversation that we'd developed. Over the past months, walking up to my parents' front door felt surreal. This had been my home for 14 years, yet now it felt foreign, like visiting a place I'd only seen in photographs. My mother answered the door, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of me. "Louisa," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "You look different." "Thanks," I replied, though I wasn't sure it was a compliment. Is Kayla here?" "In the living room," she said, stepping aside to let us in. "Dinner's almost ready." The house was exactly as I remembered it, immaculately. Clean, tastefully decorated, and strangely devoid of warmth. Family photos lined the hallway, and I noticed with a pang that in most of them, Kayla was front and center while I lingered at the edges, as if the photographer couldn't quite decide whether to include me. Kayla jumped up when she saw me, crossing the room to envelop me in a hug that surprised me with its fierceness. "I've missed you so much," she whispered. I hugged her back, realizing with a start that I'd grown taller in the months since I'd seen her last. We were now almost the same, a height. My father entered from his study, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. "Robert," he acknowledged stiffly. "Louisa." "John," Uncle Robert returned, equally formal. An awkward silence fell over the room, broken only when my mother called us to dinner. The meal was a tense affair. My mother filled the silence with questions about Kayla's classes, professors, and new friends at Princeton. My father occasionally interjected with comments about connections Kayla should make or opportunities she should pursue. Uncle Robert and I ate quietly, exchanging occasional glances that ranged from amused to exasperated. It wasn't until dessert, my mother's famous apple pie, that the conversation finally turned to me. "So, Louisa," my mother began, her tone artificially bright. "How's school going for you? Robert tells us you've joined the newspaper." I nodded, swallowing a bite of pie. "Yes, as a photographer. I really enjoy it." "Photography," my father repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. "Is there much future in that?" I felt Uncle Robert stiffen beside me, but I placed a hand on his arm. "I could handle this." "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm 15. I have time to figure out my future." Kayla knew she wanted to be a neuroscientist when she was 12, my father pointed out, and there it was, the comparison I'd been waiting for. I met his gaze steadily. "I'm not Kayla." "Clearly," he muttered. "Dad," Kayla interjected sharply. "Stop it!" He looked at her in surprise. Kayla rarely challenged him. "Stop what?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Stop comparing us," she said firmly. "Louisa is her own person with her own talents. And frankly, it's exhausting for both of us when you constantly hold me up as the standard she should meet." My mother set down her fork with a clatter. "Kayla, that's enough." "No, it's not," Kayla insisted. "Do you even realize what you did to her? You threw her out of the house for not having money she couldn't possibly have. You chose me over her, and you didn't even ask me if I needed or wanted that. Do you know how that makes me feel?" The table fell silent. I stared at my sister, seeing a strength in her I hadn't noticed before. Princeton seemed to be doing her good. "We were teaching her responsibility," my mother said weakly. "By making her homeless at 14, Kayla challenged. "That's not teaching, that's abuse." My father's face darkened. "That's enough, Kayla. You don't understand adult concerns." "I understand right from wrong," she interrupted, "and what you did was wrong." Uncle Robert cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should—" "No," my father cut him off. "I want to hear what Louisa has to say about all this, since apparently everyone else is speaking for her." All eyes turned to me. I set down my dessert fork, took a deep breath, and met my father's challenging gaze. "What do I think?" I repeated. "I think you and Mom have always seen me as an extension of Kayla, or a failed version of her, not as me. I think you threw me away when I couldn't give you what you wanted, and now you're surprised that I found somewhere I'm actually valued." "We value you," my mother protested. "No," I said gently. "You tolerate me. There's a difference. Uncle Robert values me. He sees me, the real me, not the shadow of what you wish I was." My father's jaw tightened. "So that's it? You're choosing him over your own parents?" I felt a surge of indignation. You made that choice for me when you told me to get out. We didn't think you'd actually leave, my mother exclaimed. The admission hung in the air, damning in its honesty. They'd expected me to beg, to surrender what little I had, to once again accept that my needs came last. I think we're done here, Uncle Robert said quietly, standing and placing his napkin beside his plate. Louisa, are you ready to go? I nodded, rising from my chair. Thank you for dinner. The pie was good. Kayla stood too. I'll walk you out. My parents remained seated, my mother looking stricken, my father stone-faced with anger. At the door, Kayla hugged me again. I'm sorry it went like this. I thought maybe they'd changed. It's not your job to fix them, I told her. And it's not your fault they're like this. I know, she said, but I miss you. Princeton's great, but it's lonely sometimes. You can visit us anytime, Uncle Robert offered. Our door is always open to you, Kayla. Her smile was sad but grateful. I might take you up on that. As we drove home in silence, I realized I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for years. You okay? Uncle Robert asked, glancing over at me. Yeah, I said, surprised to find it was true. I think I am. You were incredible in there, standing up for yourself like that. I looked out at the darkened streets passing by. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do, he said. When we got home, and it truly felt like home now, Uncle Robert made hot chocolate, and we sat on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the November chill. Do you think they'll ever understand? I asked, watching my breath form clouds in the cold air. I don't know, he admitted. Some people aren't capable of seeing their own mistakes. But what matters isn't whether they understand. It's that you do. You understand your worth now, and that's what will carry you forward. I leaned my head against his shoulder, grateful beyond words for this unlikely guardian who had shown me what family should be. Thanks for taking me in, I whispered. Thanks for letting me, he replied. You've made my life better, Louisa. Never doubt that. That night, I dreamed of flying, soaring above the constraints and expectations that had once held me down, free to chart my own course across an endless sky. The years that followed were a gradual unfolding of the person I was meant to be. Uncle Robert and I settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared meals, weekend adventures, and quiet evenings reading in companionable silence. My relationship with my parents remained distant and formal, occasional text messages, brief encounters, at unavoidable family events, a strained birthday card once a year. Kayla and I grew closer, ironically, once she was at Princeton. Away from our parents' influence, she became more herself, still brilliant, but also funny, occasionally rebellious, and fiercely protective of me. She visited us during breaks, often staying for days at a time in the small guest room Uncle D. Robert had set up for her. High school became a time of discovery rather than dread. I excelled in my photography classes, eventually becoming the photo editor of the school newspaper and yearbook. My grades were good, not Kayla-level perfect, but solid enough to earn me acceptance to several colleges with strong arts programs. For my 18th birthday, Uncle Robert gave me a professional-grade camera and a letter that made me cry when I read it privately in my room. In it, he expressed how proud he was of the woman I was becoming, not because of what I achieved, but because of who I was, kind, thoughtful, resilient, and true to myself. You came to me broken, he wrote, but you healed yourself. I just provided the safe space for you to do it. The strength was always yours. After 4 years of his guardianship, I was legally an adult now, free to make my own choices about where to live, what to study, who to keep in my life. The choice was easy. Uncle Robert's home remained my home, at least until college began in the fall. The question of my parents was more complicated. They had made overtures recently, suggesting family therapy, asking if I might consider spending more time with them before I left for college. Part of me wanted to close that chapter permanently, to move forward without the weight of their conditional love dragging me down. Another part wondered if people really could change, if the distance had given them perspective. "What do you think?" I asked Uncle Robert as we sat on our porch swing, now a tradition for our serious conversations. "Should I give them another chance?" He considered the question carefully. "That depends. Are you doing it for them or for yourself?" "What do you mean?" "If you're considering reconciliation because you think you owe them something, or because you're still seeking their approval, I'd say be cautious. But if you genuinely want to see if there's a relationship worth salvaging there, and you're doing it from a place of strength rather than need, then maybe it's worth exploring." I thought about it for a long time. I think I want to try. Not because I need them to love me anymore, but because I've learned from you that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about not letting it control your future. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," I replied, bumping his shoulder with mine. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a quiet cafe in town where we were less likely to fall into old patterns. I arrived first, deliberately choosing a table near the daughter for an easy exit if needed. Uncle Robert had offered to come with me, but this felt like something I needed to do alone. My parents arrived together, looking somehow smaller than I remembered. My father's hair had more gray at the temples, and my mother's carefully maintained facade showed fine lines around her eyes and mouth that makeup couldn't quite conceal. "Louisa," my mother said, her voice catching slightly. "Thank you for meeting us." I nodded, gesturing for them to sit. "Thanks for coming." An awkward silence fell as a waitress took our orders. Tea for my mother, black coffee for my father, a mocha for me. I noticed my father's eyes widen slightly at my choice, as if surprised I'd developed preferences he didn't know about. "You look well," my mother finally said. "College suits you." "I haven't started yet," I reminded her. "That's in the fall." "Of course," she said quickly. "I meant the preparation for it, the independence." Another silence. My father cleared his throat. "Louisa, your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking over the past few years, and a lot of learning." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting. "We made mistakes," he continued, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Serious ones. The way we treated you was inexcusable." "Why did you do it?" I asked. It was the question that had haunted me for years. They exchanged glances. My mother spoke first. "It's not simple," she began. "We had certain expectations, certain ideas about success and what it looked like. When Kayla fulfilled those so easily, we thought—" She trailed off. "You thought I should too," I finished for her. "And when I didn't, you decided I wasn't worth the investment." My father winced. "That's both true and not true. We were wrong, Louisa, profoundly wrong. But it wasn't because we didn't love you. It was because we didn't know how to love you as you were," my mother added softly. "We kept waiting for you to become what we expected, instead of seeing the amazing person you already were." I sat back, surprised by their candor. "What changed?" "We did," my father said simply. "Or rather, life changed us. About 2 years ago, I was passed over for a partnership at the firm I'd given 20 years to. Just like that, my guaranteed future vanished. And I had a health scare," my mother added. "Nothing serious in the end, but enough to make me realize how fleeting everything is, how quickly it can all change. And you know what?" my father continued. "Your uncle was there for us. Despite everything, despite how I'd treated him over the years, he showed up when we needed support. He never once said, 'I told you so.' He just helped." I stared at them, trying to reconcile these humbled people with the imperious parents, who had thrown water in my face and cast me out for failing to meet their demands. "We don't expect forgiveness," my mother said, reaching hesitantly across the table but stopping short of touching my hand. We haven't earned that yet, but we hoped. Maybe we could start to make amends, to get to know the remarkable young woman you've become, if you'll allow it. I studied their faces, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. All I saw was regret, hope, and a fragility I'd never associated with my formidable parents. I can't go back to how things were, I said finally. I won't be the daughter you wanted me to be. We don't want that anymore, my father assured me. We want to know who you are now, who you choose to be. I thought about Uncle Robert's words, about forgiveness being for myself rather than for them, about not letting the past control my future. I think, I said slowly, that we could try. Small steps, a dinner now and then, phone calls, see where it goes. The relief on their faces was palpable. That's more than we hoped for, my mother said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But I have conditions, I added firmly. No comparisons to Kayla, no criticism disguised as concern. And you need to respect that Robert is my family now too, the family who was there when you weren't. My father nodded solemnly. We understand, and we're grateful to him more than we can express. As we finished our drinks, making tentative plans for a dinner the following week, I realized something important. The power dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the supplicant, desperately seeking their approval. I was an adult who could set boundaries, who could choose to offer them a second chance, not from need, but from a position of strength. On the drive home, I called Uncle Robert to tell him how it went. They seem changed, I told him. Smaller, somehow, less certain. Failure and fear will do that, he said. The question is whether the change is deep enough to last. I guess we'll find out, I replied. I told them I'd have dinner with them next week. Is that okay? Louisa, he said gently, you don't need my permission. You're an adult now, free to make your own choices about who deserves a place in your life. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I know, but I value your opinion. Then my opinion is this: proceed with caution, but with an open heart. People can change when life humbles them enough. Just don't let yourself be hurt again in the process. I won't, I promised. I'm stronger now. Yes, he agreed. You always were. You just didn't know it yet. College brought new challenges and opportunities. I chose a university known for its fine arts program, about 2 hours from home, close enough to visit Uncle Robert regularly, but far enough to establish my independence. Kayla, now in medical school, after graduating from Princeton, with honors, made a point of visiting me on campus when her busy schedule allowed. We'd grown into a friendship that was no longer defined by our parents' expectations or comparisons, finding common ground in our shared experiences and divergent paths. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve, sometimes progressing, sometimes regressing when old patterns threatened to reemerge. But the fundamental difference was that now I had a choice. I could engage with them on my terms or step back when necessary. During my junior year of college, as I was beginning to gain recognition for my photography in local exhibitions, my parents came to one of my shows. I spotted them across the gallery, looking somewhat out of place among the artistic crowd, but unmistakably proud as they studied a series of portraits I'd done of elderly people in a local nursing home. These are extraordinary, Louisa, my father said when I approached them. You've captured something essential about each person. That's what I was trying to do, I explained. Show who they really are, not just how they appear. You've succeeded, my mother said, her eyes lingering on a photograph of a wizened woman with bright, mischievous eyes. There's such life in these images. Their praise still mattered to me, I realized with surprise. Not in the desperate way it once had, but as a simple human connection, one person acknowledging another's achievement. Later that evening, as we had dinner with Uncle Robert, who had also come to support my exhibition, I watched the three adults who had shaped my life interacting with a civility that would have seemed impossible a few years earlier. "She's going to go far," I overheard my father telling Uncle Robert. "You did what we couldn't. You let her become herself." "She did that on her own," Uncle Robert replied. "I just didn't get in her way." The honesty in my father's answering nod told me more than any words could about how far we'd all come. After graduation, I moved back to Uncle Robert's house temporarily, while establishing my photography business. What had started as a passion had evolved into a viable career, with commissions for portraits, events, and even some commercial work for local businesses. One evening, as I sat editing photos at the kitchen table, Uncle Robert placed a thick envelope beside my laptop. "What's this?" I asked, looking up from my work. "Something I've been saving for you," he said with a small smile. "Open it." Inside was a bank statement for an account in my name, containing an amount that made my eyes widen in shock. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at him. "I started putting away a little money each month when you first came to live with me," he explained. "For your future. It's not a fortune, but it's enough for a down payment on a place of your own, if that's what you want." Tears filled my eyes. "You've already given me so much, and you've given me more," he said simply. "A purpose, a family, joy in my everyday life that wasn't there before." I stood and hugged him fiercely. "I love you, Uncle Robert. I love you." "Too, kid," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Always will." 3 months later, I closed on a small house not far from Uncle Robert's. It needed work. The kitchen was outdated, the floors creaked, and the backyard was overgrown. But it had good bones and a warm feeling that spoke to me the moment I walked in. On moving day, I was surprised to see my parents' car pull up behind the moving truck. They emerged cautiously, my father carrying a toolbox, my mother holding a plant. "We thought you might need some help," my mother offered tentatively. "If that's okay." I looked at Uncle Robert, who shrugged with a smile that said, "Your call." "Sure," I decided. "Dad, the kitchen sink is leaking. Mom, I could use advice on curtains for the living room." The relief on their faces was worth the lingering discomfort I felt at having them in my new space. Throughout the day, the four of us worked together. Uncle Robert assembling furniture, my father fixing various small issues around the house, my mother organizing the kitchen while I unpacked my photography equipment. At one point, I found myself alone in the backyard with my father as he examined the ancient grill left by the previous owners. "This can be salvaged," he pronounced after a thorough inspection. "Just needs a good cleaning and some new parts." "Like a lot of things," I commented, not looking at him directly. He straightened up, understanding my meaning immediately. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Like a lot of things." We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken weight of our history between us. "I'm proud of you, Louisa," he finally said. "Not because of what you've accomplished, though that's impressive, but because of who you are. The woman you've become despite us, not because of us." I met his gaze then, seeing genuine regret and pride mingled in his eyes. "Thank you," I said simply. "I know we can't undo the past," he continued, "and I know Robert is more your father than I ever was. I've come to accept that and to be grateful for it. He gave you what we couldn't or wouldn't." "Yes," I agreed, not bothering to soften the truth. "But I hope," he said hesitantly, "that there might still be room in your life for us, in whatever capacity you're comfortable with." I thought about it, genuinely weighing the question rather than giving an automatic response. "I think there is," I decided, "not as the parents who threw me out at 14, but as the people you're trying to become now." He nodded, accepting the distinction. "That's fair. More than fair." When we went back inside, I found Uncle Robert and my mother looking through a photo album I'd compiled over the years. Pictures of my life with Uncle Robert, my college years, trips we'd taken together, everyday moments captured and preserved. You have her smile, my mother was saying to Uncle Robert. I never noticed before, but it's the same. The Thompson smile, Uncle Robert agreed. Our mother's gift to us. Something about seeing them together, acknowledging their shared history, without rancor, made my heart swell with an unexpected feeling, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of healing. That night, after everyone had left and I was alone in my new house, I sat on the porch swing I'd insisted on installing as a reminder of all the important conversations Uncle Robert and I had shared on his. The neighborhood was quiet. The stars, bright overhead, the future spread before me like an unwritten story. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from a frightened 14-year-old standing under a streetlight with all her possessions in a backpack, to a 25-year-old woman with a career, a home, and a complex but healing family. I thought about the water my mother had thrown in my face all those years ago, intended to shame and control me. How that same water had, ironically, cleared my vision and set me on a path to finding my true worth. Most of all, I thought about Uncle Robert, who had shown me what unconditional love looked like, not perfect, not without challenges, but steady and true and accepting of who I really was. I pulled out my phone and texted him, "Thank you for everything. I wouldn't be who I am without you." His reply came moments later. "You would. You always had it in you. I just had the privilege of watching you discover it." I smiled, tucking the phone away and leaning back to look at the stars. The past couldn't be changed, but it no longer defined me. The future was unwritten, full of possibility, and the present, this moment, this life I had built, was more than enough.